The wooden airplane was still warm from his pocket when Eddie Kowalski died. Blue and yellow paint worn smooth by a child's fingers, carried across an ocean to a war that would end with his blood in Belgian snow. He pressed it into Jimmy Stewart's hand with his last breath, whispering about Christmas morning and a mother who would never know what her son's final words had been. 37 years later, the Hollywood legend was holding that same airplane when the letter arrived. Jimmy Stewart dropped it twice before he could tear open the envelope. His hands were shaking, but not from age, from a secret that had been eating him alive since 1944. The return address made his chest tight. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, Detroit, Michigan, the mother of a boy who died believing Jimmy would keep his promise. He'd lied to a dying soldier, and America had made him a hero for it. The letter was 3 paragraphs, polite, devastating. Miss Kowalski had spent 37 years tracking down survivors of her son's unit, following paper trails through Veterans Administration files, talking to anyone who might have known what happened to Private Eddie Kowalski in those final moments. She just wanted to know if her boy had suffered, if he'd been brave, if he'd said anything about home. Simple questions that would destroy the man America thought they knew. Jimmy Stewart, the conscience of a generation, the face of American decency, had spent 4 decades hiding from a grieving mother. The medals on his wall, the general's stars, the magazine covers calling him a hero, all of it built on a foundation of cowardice. Because heroes don't break promises to dying boys. Now that boy's mother had found him. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about courage. Jimmy Stewart wasn't supposed to be on the ground. He was a captain, a pilot, flying B-24 bombing missions over Germany, 20 successful runs without losing a man. But on December 15th, everything went wrong. Flak over the Ardennes tore his plane apart. 2 engines out, half his crew wounded. Jimmy had crash-landed in a Belgian field with no radio and enemy patrols closing in. Eddie Kowalski was the radio operator, 18 years old, from Detroit, supposed to get married when the war ended. He'd been talking about his girl all morning, about the garage he was going to run, about his mother's pierogi and how she worried about him getting enough to eat. Now Eddie was dying, and all he wanted was for someone to tell his mother he'd been thinking about her. Jimmy knelt in the snow, holding the boy's hand while the rest of the crew tried to signal for rescue. Eddie's breath was coming in short puffs of steam, and his eyes were getting glassy, but he was still trying to smile. "Captain," Eddie whispered, pulling a blood-stained letter from his pocket. "This is for my ma. Will you make sure she gets it?" Jimmy took the letter. "You'll deliver it yourself, son. We're gonna get you out of here." But Eddie shook his head. He knew. They both knew. "Promise me," Eddie said, gripping Jimmy's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll tell her about the airplane. Tell her I remembered." Jimmy Stewart gave his word. "I promise, Eddie, I'll tell her." Eddie smiled then, peaceful and unafraid, and died thinking Jimmy would keep his promise. They shipped the war hero home to parades and photographers. Jimmy Stewart, the pilot who'd led 20 bombing missions over Germany, brought his men back safe. Except for Eddie Kowalski, and Eddie's letter was burning a hole in his desk drawer. But what Jimmy Stewart did next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The war hero tried to find Mrs. Kowalski, really tried. But this was 1946, and Eddie's mother had remarried after her husband died in a factory accident. Changed her name, moved from Detroit to somewhere in Ohio. No forwarding address, no phone listing. The trail went cold, and the Hollywood-bound veteran told himself he'd done everything he could. But that was a lie, and Jimmy Stewart knew it. The truth was scarier than enemy fire over Germany. The future movie star was afraid of a grieving mother's tears, afraid of sitting in her kitchen and watching her world crumble when he described her son's last moments, afraid that delivering Eddie's message would drag him back to that frozen field in Belgium. So the movie star did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He put the letter in a drawer and walked away. Hollywood was calling. Frank Capra wanted Jimmy Stewart for a picture about a man who thought his life didn't matter. The irony cut like a knife. America's newest leading man was about to play someone learning the value of existence while carrying the weight of a promise he was too cowardly to keep. It's a Wonderful Life made the former bomber pilot a star. But every time Stewart said George Bailey's lines about the value of every human life, he thought about Eddie Kowalski bleeding out in the snow. Every Christmas scene reminded him of a wooden airplane and a mother who didn't know her son had died thinking about her. The applause got louder. Jimmy Stewart's guilt got heavier. Winchester 73, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Vertigo. Movie after movie, the decorated war veteran became America's moral compass, the man who always did the right thing on screen. But at home, in the silence of his Beverly Hills mansion, he was just a coward who'd broken his word to a dying soldier, and there was something else eating at America's golden boy that no one knew about. Every single night for decades, Jimmy Stewart would sit in his study and open that bottom drawer. He'd hold Eddie's letter, reading it by lamplight, imagining the conversation he should have had with Mrs. Kowalski years ago. He'd practice the words, rehearse the apology, plan the meeting that never happened. The bloodstains on the paper had long since turned brown, the edges were soft from handling, but the weight of those words never got lighter. If anything, they got heavier with each passing year. Some nights the aging actor would pick up the phone, dial information, ask for Detroit, get as far as Kowalski before hanging up. Because what do you say to a mother after 5 years, after 10, after 20? How do you explain that fear kept you silent when grief was waiting for comfort? You won't believe what happened next. Every Christmas for 37 years, Jimmy Stewart set an extra place at his dinner table. He never told anyone who it was for, but those closest to him knew. They'd seen him staring at that empty chair, lost in thoughts he couldn't share. They'd watched America's most beloved actor carry a burden that was slowly destroying him from the inside. Because while America applauded Jimmy Stewart the hero, the former Air Force captain was drowning in shame. The breaking point came in 1975. Hollywood's golden boy was at a celebrity party, surrounded by reporters, when someone asked him about his war service. The usual questions about courage under fire, about what makes a hero. Stewart gave the usual answers about duty and sacrifice. But later, alone in his car, the man who'd played George Bailey broke down and wept for the first time since Eddie died. Something cracked inside the aging star that night. Sitting in his Lincoln Continental outside the Beverly Hills Hotel, Jimmy Stewart realized he wasn't crying for Eddie anymore. He was crying for himself, for the man he could have been, for the promise that had rotted away in a desk drawer while he played heroes on screen. He thought about Eddie's last words, about a wooden airplane, about a mother in Detroit who'd probably given up hope years ago. Jimmy Stewart realized something that night that changed everything. He wasn't mourning Eddie anymore. He was mourning himself, the man he could have been if he'd kept his promise, the man Eddie had believed him to be when he'd trusted him with his mother's letter. But America's sweetheart thought it was too late. 31 years had passed. Mrs. Kowalski was probably dead, or moved, or remarried so many times that finding her would be impossible. So the aging actor buried his guilt deeper and kept playing the man America wanted him to be. The movie star went home that night and sat in his study until dawn, holding Eddie's letter. For the first time in decades, he didn't put it back in the drawer. He left it on his desk, in plain sight. A reminder of the man he'd failed to be. A promise he'd failed to keep. A boy who died believing in someone who didn't deserve that faith. From that night forward, Jimmy Stewart was a changed man, not publicly. Publicly, he was still America's sweetheart, still the dependable leading man, still the war hero who'd served his country with honor. But privately, the Hollywood legend was slowly dying inside. What happened next will shock you. Until Tuesday morning, 1981, when next year finally came calling. Mrs. Kowalski's letter was a miracle and a nightmare wrapped in the same envelope. She'd spent decades tracking down survivors of her son's unit, talking to veterans organizations, following paper trails that led nowhere, until she found a military chaplain who remembered a Captain Stewart who'd been with Eddie when he died. She wasn't angry in the letter. She didn't demand explanations. She just wanted to know if her boy had suffered, if he'd been brave, if he'd said anything about home. Simple questions from a mother who'd spent 37 years wondering about her son's last moments. The aging movie star read the letter 5 times before the words really sank in. Then he walked to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Underneath insurance papers and old contracts, Eddie's letter was still there. The bloodstains had turned brown with age, but the paper was still soft from being handled by a boy who'd read it 100 times before he died. Jimmy Stewart had read it once, the day Eddie died. It was just a kid telling his mother about the weather in England, about the food at the base, about missing her cooking. Normal things, safe things. But at the end, Eddie had written something that the Hollywood legend had never forgotten. "Ma, if something happens to me over here, just remember I was thinking about Christmas morning when I was 8. About that blue and yellow airplane you made me. About how proud I was to carry something you'd made with your own hands. I still got it with me. Still think about how you painted it just my favorite colors without me even asking. The former bomber pilot had been carrying that letter for 37 years. 37 years of wondering if Mrs. Kowalski was waiting for news. 37 years of knowing that somewhere in America, a mother was going to bed every night not knowing how much her son had loved her. And for 37 years Jimmy Stewart had been too afraid to pick up the phone. But something happened next that nobody could have predicted. Maybe it was the gentle way she'd written it. Maybe it was the fact that she'd never stopped looking for him. Or maybe it was just that Jimmy Stewart, Hollywood's moral compass, was finally tired of being a coward. He picked up the phone and dialed information. Detroit, Michigan, the silver screen legend said when the operator answered. Eleanor Kowalski. His hands were steady now. His voice was clear. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, America's golden boy knew exactly what he had to do. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Hello, Mrs. Kowalski. This is Jimmy Stewart. I believe you wrote me a letter about your son Eddie. There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. Oh my dear Lord. Mr. Stewart, I can't believe, I hoped, but I never really thought. Ma'am, the aging actor said, his voice steady for the first time in years. I owe you an apology that's 37 years overdue, and I have something that belongs to you. When Mrs. Kowalski spoke again, her voice was thick with tears she'd probably been holding back for decades. Was he brave, Mr. Stewart? At the end, was my Eddie brave? Jimmy Stewart closed his eyes and saw Eddie's face in the snow, peaceful and unafraid. He was the bravest young man I ever knew, ma'am, and he died with your name on his lips. 3 days later, the Hollywood icon did something he should have done in 1944. He got in his car and drove to Detroit, not to mail the letter, not to call, but to look a mother in the eyes and accept whatever judgment he found there, because some promises are too important for shortcuts. Some apologies require you to show up in person and face the consequences of your failure. Mrs. Kowalski lived in a small house on a tree-lined street that reminded the former Air Force pilot of Indiana where he'd grown up. She met him at the door, a woman in her 70s with Eddie's eyes and a smile that made the aging movie star's heart ache. She'd been beautiful once, he could tell, the kind of woman who'd raised a son like Eddie, who'd loved him enough to paint toy airplanes in his favorite colors. They sat in her living room, surrounded by a shrine to a young man who'd never gotten the chance to grow old. Eddie in his high school cap and gown, Eddie in his army uniform, Eddie with his arm around a pretty girl at what looked like a church dance, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. Jimmy Stewart told her everything. About the crash, about Eddie's last words, about the promise he'd made in the snow. He told her about the 37 years of cowardice, about the guilt that had poisoned every success, about the empty chair he'd set at his table every Christmas. He handed her Eddie's letter and watched her read it with trembling fingers. Watched her cry over words she'd waited 37 years to see. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. He mentions the airplane, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I made that for him when he was 8. Painted it blue and yellow, his favorite colors. He carried it everywhere until the other boys made fun of him for playing with toys. But he kept it. He took it to war. She stood and walked to a china cabinet, returning with something wrapped in tissue paper. It was the wooden airplane, painted blue and yellow, worn smooth by a child's hands. The army sent me his effects, she said, placing the toy airplane in the war hero's hands. This was in his pocket when he died. All these years I wondered why he'd kept it. Now I know. He was carrying a piece of home, a piece of love. Jimmy Stewart held the little airplane and felt something break loose in his chest. A knot that had been there for 37 years, finally starting to unravel. Mrs. Kowalski, he said, his voice cracking, can you ever forgive me for taking so long, for being such a coward? The old woman reached over and patted his hand like he was one of her own children. Mr. Stewart, you kept the most important promise. You remembered my boy. You carried him with you all these years. That's more than I ever dared hope for. She paused, studying Jimmy's face. But I need you to understand something. Eddie didn't die thinking you'd failed him. He died believing in you. And for 37 years you've been punishing yourself for being human. Jimmy Stewart left Detroit that evening, knowing he'd finally done what he should have done decades earlier. Not the heroic thing, not the movie star thing, just the right thing. He'd kept a promise to a dying boy, even if it had taken him 37 years to find the courage. Kowalski walked him to his car. Before he got in, she pressed the wooden airplane into his hands. I want you to have this, she said. Eddie would have wanted you to have it. You brought him home to me, Mr. Stewart. After all these years, you finally brought my boy home. Jimmy Stewart died on July 2, 1997, in his Beverly Hills home. Among the Hollywood legend's personal effects, his family found a small wooden airplane, painted blue and yellow, and a letter from a mother in Detroit thanking him for his courage. Not his courage in the movies, not his courage in the war, but his courage to finally face his fears and do what was right. The airplane sits in a place of honor now, in a museum dedicated to the screen icon's life. But the real monument isn't made of wood and paint. It's the understanding that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about finding the strength to make things right, even when you think it's too late. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in the sky over enemy territory. Sometimes they're fought in your own heart, against your own shame, against the voice that tells you you've waited too long to do what's right. Jimmy Stewart, America's moral compass, learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's calling that phone number anyway. It's driving to Detroit after 37 years of running away. It's looking a grieving mother in the eyes and accepting her forgiveness even when you can't forgive yourself. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to keep a promise to the people we love, that redemption doesn't have an expiration date, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply picking up the phone and saying the words you should have said decades ago. Do you have promises waiting to be kept? Words that need to be spoken. Someone who deserves to know they were loved. Sometimes the people we think we've lost are still waiting for us to find the courage to reach out. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, and thank you for taking this journey with us today.